The lecture hall at St. Anome University was packed, the air filled with the rapid flashes of press cameras. At the center of it all was Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, who had just stepped into the bustling symposium on education and politics in the 21st century. She carried herself with confidence but chose a discreet seat in the back, hoping to blend into the crowd. However, Dr. Williams, an esteemed calculus professor known for his sharp intellect and sharper disdain for certain politicians, had already spotted her, his gaze cold and unyielding fixed on Leavitt. He didn't like her. To him, she wasn't a product of intellect but of media exposure and luck, a young face of the Trump administration who had risen too quickly. A smirk curled on his lips. With deliberate steps, he moved to the chalkboard and, in his signature, sarcastic tone, announced, "It seems we have a special guest today. Miss Leavitt is often called intelligent. Let's see if that reputation holds up." The students stirred, some chuckling, others glancing curiously at the reporters who had their cameras locked onto the unfolding moment. With swift, practiced strokes, Dr. Williams wrote out a complex integral, an equation so intricate that even top students would hesitate before attempting it. He stepped back, eyes glinting with amusement. Silence fell. Leavitt stood unfazed and made her way to the board. The room tensed. Reporters leaned in, eager for the humiliation they expected to capture. But she picked up the chalk without hesitation. Her eyes scanned the problem once, then she began. The chalk glided effortlessly across the surface. Variable substitution, function simplification, partial integration, each step executed with precision. The students held their breath, some sneaking glances at their own notes to keep up. Within 2 minutes, she set the chalk down. The solution was flawless. "Done," she said softly, turning to face Dr. Williams. Murmurs rippled through the hall. "Did she really solve that?" Someone whispered. "That was fast," another muttered. Dr. Williams stood frozen, his forced smirk faltering. He stepped to the board, scanning every line for an error, any error, but found none. Clearing his throat, he straightened, masking his discomfort. "That was just a warm-up," he said, feigning indifference. "Don't get too full of yourself." But inside he was rattled. He had expected her to stumble, to expose herself as nothing more than a polished politician. Instead, she had handled the problem with a level of mastery he hadn't anticipated. Leavitt returned to her seat composed. But as she sat, memories surfaced. Late nights at St. Anome, teaching herself advanced math to analyze election data and media strategies. To her, math wasn't just numbers. It was a tool, one that revealed trends, predicted outcomes, and shaped decisions. Dr. Williams wasn't done. With renewed determination, he turned back to the board. This time he crafted a problem far more daunting, a series of nested derivatives that demanded razor-sharp reasoning. Crossing his arms, he stepped back, his voice laced with mockery. "Go ahead, Miss Leavitt," he challenged. "Or do you need a spokesperson to assist you?" A few students chuckled, but the laughter quickly faded as Leavitt rose once more. Calmly, she walked to the board, picked up the chalk, and met Dr. Williams' gaze. "Thank you for the challenge, Professor." Her voice was steady, brimming with quiet confidence. Then she began. Again, the room fell silent. The chalk moved swiftly, her thought process precise and unerring. As she worked through the problem, she paused briefly and glanced at the students. "Derivatives are about understanding how things change," she said, her tone light but instructive, kind of like predicting an election. A few students nodded in understanding. Then the final answer appeared, flawless once again. Dr. Williams' fingers clenched around the edge of the board. A hush settled over the hall, jaws slack in disbelief. "She might actually be a genius," someone whispered. Cameras clicked. Reporters took furious notes. Leavitt set the chalk down and turned, her expression unreadable. "Anything else, Professor?" "Professor?" Leavitt's voice was gentle but edged with challenge. Dr. Williams took a deep breath, struggling to maintain his composure. "Not so fast," he growled, his tone tight with frustration. "We're not done yet." His hand trembled slightly as he erased the board, preparing his next move. The students exchanged glances, sensing the tension thickening. The real battle had just begun. The air in the lecture hall grew heavy as Dr. Williams turned back, his gaze cold and calculating. He wrote out a new problem, this one far more intricate, a tangled web of derivatives blending exponential and logarithmic functions. Even senior students would struggle. Arms crossed, a smirk creeping back onto his face, he turned to Leavitt. "If you're truly skilled, try this," he mocked. "Or was the first one just luck?" Whispers spread through the room. Some students glanced nervously at their notes, attempting to decipher the problem. Reporters adjusted their cameras, sensing the moment escalating. Karoline Leavitt stepped forward once more, chalk in hand. She studied the equation for a few seconds, then, with the same effortless confidence, began to write. The room watched in silence. Step by step, she unraveled the complex chain, applying the chain rule, simplifying functions with surgical precision. Midway through, she paused and turned to the class. "Derivatives are about understanding change," she said with a small smile, like predicting the shifts in a political campaign. A few students nodded as if math had just clicked into place. The chalk moved again, smooth and deliberate. Within minutes, the answer stood complete, flawless. Leavitt set the chalk down and turned to Dr. Williams. "Done, Professor," she said, her voice steady. The room erupted. "She did it again," a red-haired student whispered. "That was so fast." Another murmured, eyes wide. Reporters furiously scribbled notes. Camera lenses zoomed in, capturing every detail, but Dr. Williams refused to yield. He stepped forward, scanning the answer for mistakes, searching for anything to undermine her. His face flushed as realization sank in. It was perfect. Again. His throat tightened. "Miss Leavitt," he started, then hesitated. He needed a new angle. "You seem well prepared, but who's to say you didn't memorize these beforehand?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the students. "Yeah," a messy-haired student named Josh blurted out. "How can she be that good? She must have seen these problems before." Another student, a bespectacled girl, whispered, "She's a press secretary, not a mathematician. Could she have cheated?" Dr. Williams smirked, seizing the moment. "Good point, Josh," he said before turning back to Leavitt. "For fairness, why don't we pick a random problem? Any page from the textbook." A hush fell over the hall. Reporters grinned, knowing this twist would make the story even bigger. But Leavitt didn't flinch. She simply nodded, a small, knowing smile forming on her lips. "Sure," she said smoothly. She walked over to the professor's desk, grabbed a copy of Calculus Early Transcendentals, and flipped randomly to page 247. Her finger landed on a high-order derivative problem tangled with nested trigonometric functions, harder than the last. Without hesitation, she picked up the chalk and began, every step unfolded with crisp precision, applying the product rule, taking partial derivatives, simplifying. Students held their breath. Some discreetly recorded the moment, on their phones. Dr. Williams stood aside, fists clenched, trying to maintain his composure. But as Leavitt finished placing the chalk down with quiet finality, his face betrayed his disbelief. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath, eyes scanning for flaws. But there were none. The lecture hall was stunned. "She actually did it," a short-haired girl gasped. "Not just good," another student whispered, eyes gleaming. "She's insanely fast." Leavitt turned to Dr. Williams, her expression unreadable. "Any more doubts, Professor?" Her voice was soft, but the challenge was unmistakable. The room burst into applause. Some students whistled. Reporters exchanged glances, knowing this clip would explode on social media within hours. But Dr. Williams wasn't done. His face burned red as he snatched the chalk, erasing the board in angry strokes. "Don't celebrate yet," he snapped, his voice shaking with frustration. The students hushed. You think you're good? His hand moved furiously, scrawling a sprawling, nonlinear differential equation. Exponentials, complex variables, the kind of problem even professors hesitated to solve on the spot. Gasps spread through the room. A bespectacled girl clutched her notebook. I don't even understand the question, she whispered. Josh just stared, mouth open. What is that? The students turned to Leavitt. Would she try? Would she dare? Reporters zoomed in, capturing every chalk mark as the equation took shape. Dr. Williams stepped back, arms crossed, eyes blazing. Miss Leavitt, he said, his voice triumphant. If you solve this, I'll quit teaching. Go ahead. Silence fell over the lecture hall. The air was thick, charged like the moment before a final showdown. Josh bowed his head, gripping his chair. Everyone thought it was impossible, a problem far beyond the undergraduate curriculum, designed to crush her. Reporters smirked, already imagining the headline. Press secretary fails impossible math challenge. Leavitt stood before the board, chalk in hand, scanning the equation. This time she paused longer than before. She can't do it, a messy-haired boy whispered. Look, she's hesitating, a short-haired girl added, voice anxious. Doctor. Williams grinned smugly, certain he had won. Then Leavitt turned to the class and smiled. Anyone want to tackle this with me? The room froze. Is she joking? A student blurted out. This isn't a group project, another protested. Leavitt shook her head, her voice calm. Math is how we figure out the world together. Help me out. The students hesitated, stunned. Then, a timid girl with her hair tied high raised her hand. I think we need to separate the variables. First, she said, voice shaky. Leavitt nodded, breaking the equation into two parts, handling each function separately. Good call. She turned to the room. Who's got the next idea? A bespectacled boy stood. Use a substitution. It'll simplify it. Leavitt smiled, applying it instantly, chalk gliding across the board. The energy in the room shifted. Whispers turned into lively discussion. Add the constant, someone shouted. Exactly, Leavitt replied, completing the final step. Dr. Williams stood aside, hands limp, his grin gone. He hadn't expected her to turn his challenge into a collaborative lesson. Piece by piece the equation took shape. Leavitt solved the differential part, balanced both sides, and at last delivered the final answer. Flawless. She set the chalk down and turned to the class. Done, she said, her voice calm. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, applause erupted. Whistles and cheers filled the air. Unbelievable, the short-haired girl shouted. She actually did it, the messy-haired boy exclaimed, eyes wide. Reporters filmed frantically, knowing this would dominate social media within hours. Leavitt looked at Dr. Williams, her expression free of arrogance. Professor, she said, math isn't just numbers. It's how I calculate policy impacts like economic forecasts, voter trends, and social shifts. It's everywhere. The students nodded. Some clapped again. The timid girl who had first spoken stepped forward. You made me think. Math is kind of fun, she admitted. Laughter rippled through the hall, the tension easing, but Dr. Williams didn't laugh. He stepped toward the board, checking her answer, his hands trembling. No errors. He turned back to her, face pale, voice faint. How did you do it? Leavitt smiled, perching on the edge of the professor's desk, completely at ease. I learned because I was curious, Professor. Her voice was soft but sure. Back at St. Ansel, I taught myself math to understand politics, from election trends to policy outcomes. It's never been foreign to me. The students' jaws dropped. Admiration flickered in their eyes. Reporters jotted down notes. Leavitt isn't just a press secretary, she's a math genius. Dr. Williams stood there, blinking rapidly, his pride crumbling. He had set out to humiliate her. Instead, he had been outmatched before his own class. Applause swelled again, louder this time. Students stood, whistling, some shouting, "She's incredible." Cameras captured the moment. Leavitt standing before the board, calm amid a storm of admiration. The non-linear differential equation remained on the board, undeniable proof of her skill. But something had changed. Students weren't just impressed. They looked at her differently now, not as a distant political figure, but as someone who had made math feel alive. The timid girl stepped closer. "Miss Leavitt," she asked, voice uncertain, "how are you so good? I've never seen anyone solve that fast." The room hushed, waiting for her answer. Leavitt's smile softened. "I'm not a born genius," she said simply. "At St. Ansel, I taught myself math to understand data, how voter opinions shift, how policies play out. Math is a tool, not just numbers on a page." The students nodded. Some whispered to each other. Leavitt had done more than just win. She had changed the way they saw math, and maybe even the way they saw themselves. Murmurs spread through the room. "That makes sense, Josh." The boy who had doubted her stood up, his face red with shame. I'm sorry for thinking you cheated," he mumbled. "But how did you get that good? You're so busy, right?" Leavitt laughed, her eyes warm. "Busy? Yeah," she admitted. "But I love a challenge. Being press secretary is like solving math, finding order in chaos. I learned because I was curious, not because anyone forced me." Laughter rippled through the class, the tension easing. Reporters scribbled furiously. Leavitt turns math into a political superpower. A bespectacled girl in the front row raised her hand timidly. "I'm terrible at math," she admitted, her voice quiet. "Could I ever do what you do? I always thought I wasn't smart enough." Silence settled over the room. All eyes turned to Leavitt. She stepped closer to the girl, bending down to meet her gaze. "I've been told that too," she shared. "When I started out, people said I was too young, too feminine, not good enough. But intelligence isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. If you stay curious and don't give up, you'll get there." The girl's eyes lit up. She smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, voice choked with emotion. More students chimed in. "Are you ever afraid of failing?" a messy-haired boy asked. Leavitt nodded. "Of course, but failure teaches me more than success, like that last problem. If I never tried, I'd never know I could do it." The class nodded. Some even jotted down her words. The short-haired girl stood. "You make me want to study math again," she admitted. "It's not as dry as I thought." Laughter rang out, the room buzzing with fresh energy. Reporters captured everything, knowing that Leavitt hadn't just won a challenge, she had changed something in the students. In the corner, Dr. Williams stood with his arms tightly crossed, his face dark. He listened to every word, but inside a storm raged. He had wanted to disgrace her, to prove she didn't belong. But now, he felt small. He looked at the students, once in awe of him, now captivated by her. Where did I go wrong? Memories flooded back. He had once been an activist, believing that education could change the world. But somewhere along the way, he had become arrogant, tearing others down to protect his own reputation. Leavitt wasn't just good at math. She had done something he had forgotten how to do. She had inspired. Dr. Williams took a step closer to the board, his hand brushing against Leavitt's perfect answer. His eyes flickered, blinking rapidly. The students didn't notice, but the reporters did. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment he wavered. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his tough exterior. But inside, he knew he hadn't just lost. At math, he had lost his vision. Leavitt looked at him, her gaze not hostile but empathetic. "Professor," she said softly, just for him, "everyone messes up sometimes. What matters is what we learn." Her words pierced his pride like a dagger. The students whispered, eyes shining with admiration. Some discreetly recorded her words on their phones. Reporters scribbled furiously, lenses still locked onto Leavitt. She wasn't just the White House press secretary anymore. She had turned a math challenge into a life lesson. Dr. Williams stood motionless, his hands limp, his eyes locked on the equation that remained intact, on the board. The laughter and chatter of the student stung his pride. He had wanted to humiliate her. Now, he felt like the one out of place in his own classroom. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and lightly touched Leavitt's flawless answer. The students quieted, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Reporters zoomed in. A pivotal moment was coming. Dr. Williams exhaled. When he spoke, his voice was low, slow, a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. "All right," he said, turning to Leavitt. His gaze was no longer hostile. It was filled with something else. Reflection. "Leavitt," he said, pausing as if gathering courage. "I was wrong." The room fell dead silent. Josh's jaw dropped. The bespectacled girl smiled faintly, as if they had just witnessed the impossible. Dr. Williams continued, his voice steady. "I thought you were just a young politician, relying on fame and looks, but today you proved me completely wrong." Leavitt met his gaze, her eyes warm, devoid of triumph. She stepped closer. Her voice was gentle. "Thank you, Professor," she said. "But everyone makes mistakes. I've been underestimated too. For being young, for being a woman, for not fitting the mold." She smiled. "What matters is what we learn from it." Leavitt's words floated through the room like a breeze, easing the last traces of tension. Students nodded. Some even clapped softly. Not to mock Dr. Williams, but to acknowledge the sincerity between them. Dr. Williams bowed his head for a moment, then looked up, his voice softer than before. "I've taught math for decades," he admitted, "but today you taught me a bigger lesson. You're not just skilled, you made these students want to learn, want to understand." He exhaled, his gaze sweeping over the class. "I'd forgotten that. Forgotten that education isn't about showing off, but about inspiring." He turned toward the board where Leavitt's answer remained untouched, her logic as clear as day. "You did what I couldn't today." This time the applause came louder. Whistles rang out, not just for Leavitt's talent, but for Dr. Williams' rare humility. The short-haired girl laughed. "Professor, thanks to you, we just had the best class ever." Laughter rippled through the room, the energy shifting. "Yeah," the messy-haired boy added. Calling Miss Leavitt to the board was genius. For the first time that day, Dr. Williams smiled. It was small, a little awkward, but real. He turned to Leavitt, nodding slightly, a silent acknowledgement of both respect and defeat. The reporters scribbled furiously. Dr. Williams admits mistake, a viral moment in the making. Leavitt stepped forward, offering her hand. "Professor," she said sincerely, "you didn't lose. You helped me prove that math isn't just a test, it's how we understand each other, how we understand the world." Dr. Williams hesitated for only a second before gripping her hand. His squeeze was light but firm, his eyes glistening as if rediscovering something long lost. "You're right," he murmured, voice hoarse. "I was too proud." He paused, then added, "Thank you, Leavitt." The students erupted into applause again, this time longer, louder. It wasn't just a celebration of victory, but of reconciliation. A rare moment where two former adversaries found common ground. The reporters knew they had captured something special, not just a display of mathematical prowess, but a moment of humility and transformation. "She's amazing," someone whispered. "But the professor's cool for admitting that," another added. The handshake between Karoline Leavitt and Dr. Williams would be the image that spread across headlines and social media. Laughter and chatter filled the room as the energy lifted. Reporters captured Leavitt standing among the students, smiling warmly, while Dr. Williams stepped back, his expression pensive yet relieved. This hadn't just been a battle of wits. It had become a moment that changed the way people saw math, each other, and themselves. Leavitt stepped to the center of the room, raising a hand to quiet the crowd. "Thank you all for joining me today," she said, her voice youthful yet commanding. "Math isn't just numbers on a board. It's how we understand the world, from politics and economics to everyday life. I hope you see now that it's not something to fear. It's a tool for discovery. Students nodded, murmuring among themselves. She's right, someone whispered. The timid girl with her hair tied up laughed. You make me want to start math all over. I've never seen it this fun. The room burst into laughter and agreement. A bespectacled boy raised his hand. Miss Leavitt, do you think anyone can get good at math if they try? Leavitt's eyes sparkled. Absolutely, she said. I wasn't great at it at first. At St. Ansel, I struggled with data. But I was curious. I tried and I learned. You can too. Just don't give up. The applause wasn't just for solving a difficult equation anymore. It was for something bigger, believing in themselves. A reporter scribbled a final note. Leavitt, more than a math whiz, a teacher at heart. The short-haired girl shot up from her chair, grinning. That's it. I'm taking math seriously now. Thanks to you. Cheers and whistles filled the air. Josh, the boy who had doubted her, laughed loudly. Me too, Professor, you have to bring her back again. The class turned to Dr. Williams expectantly. He stood still for a moment, then, to everyone's surprise, nodded. I'll consider it. Brief words, but enough. Enough to show that he had changed, not just in his opinion of Leavitt, but in his willingness to keep learning. Leavitt turned to him, stepping closer. Professor, she said quietly, just for him. Thank you for this challenge. It didn't just help me. It showed these students how important math is. Dr. Williams held her gaze, his eyes shimmering. Then for the second time, he shook her hand. No, he said, voice rough with emotion. Thank you. I've taught for years, but today, I learned from you. He exhaled, the weight of the day settling. Education isn't about competing, it's about sharing. He offered a small, almost reluctant smile. And today, you did it better than me. The students didn't hear his last words, but the reporters did. Their cameras zoomed in, knowing this was the moment that would touch millions. Slowly, the students stood, crowding around Leavitt, firing excited questions. How do you balance work and learning? Any tricks? Leavitt laughed, answering, each one like a friend. Reporters packed up their notes, leaving with footage of an entire saga, one that had started with doubt and ended in inspiration. And as Leavitt stood in the center of the room, surrounded by eager students, one thing was clear. She hadn't just won a math challenge. She had changed something, maybe even changed them. The messy-haired student whipped out his phone, capturing a quick video of Leavitt chatting with her classmates. Without hesitation, he posted it on X. Karoline Leavitt just made math class the best ever. Leavitt math genius. The post spread like wildfire. Within minutes, dozens of comments flooded in. She's incredible. Dr. Williams rocks too for admitting he was wrong. Leavitt exited the lecture hall to the sound of applause, leaving behind a buzzing atmosphere. Students clustered together, still discussing the moment. She makes me want to push myself harder, one said. Math's not a nightmare anymore, another added. A bespectacled girl turned to her friend, eyes shining. I'm signing up for advanced math next semester thanks to her. But Leavitt's impact didn't stop at the classroom doors. It rippled outward, reshaping how everyone in that room viewed learning and their own potential. Dr. Williams lingered behind, staring at the now empty board. An odd sense of relief settled over him. He had entered the classroom that morning, with one goal, to humiliate Leavitt, to protect his reputation. But now he felt grateful. She hadn't just beaten him with skill, she had taught him something he had long forgotten. Education wasn't about proving superiority. It was about inspiring. A small smile tugged at his lips as he murmured to himself, She's right. It's what we learn that matters. He left the lecture hall carrying a lesson far greater than any equation he had ever taught. As Karoline Leavitt's footsteps faded down the hall, the students remained, still caught up in the moment. She made me believe math isn't that hard, the short-haired girl said, eyes gleaming. Yeah, someone else chimed in. She turned it into a game. Josh, the one who had doubted her, laughed as he checked his X post, now past 1,000 likes. Reporters gathered their gear, preparing to upload their footage. They had caught everything: the harsh challenge, Leavitt's triumph, and the handshake of reconciliation. They knew this story wouldn't end here. Dr. Williams stood alone in the empty classroom, the late afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. He traced his fingers across the board, feeling the faint chalk dust left behind. His heart was heavy, and yet somehow lighter. That morning, he had walked into this room intending to embarrass Leavitt, to make her a laughingstock and safeguard his status. But now, he felt small, not because he had lost, but because he had realized how his pride had blinded him for so long. "How did I get it so wrong?" he muttered. Memories flooded back. His early days as a young, passionate teacher who truly believed education could change the world. But somewhere along the way he had lost that purpose. He had become someone who used knowledge to dominate rather than share. Leavitt had done what he had long forgotten how to do. She didn't just solve problems. She made students love them, believe in them. For the first time that day, Dr. Williams smiled. A real, unforced smile. "She's right," he murmured. "True intelligence isn't about fame or power. It's the passion to learn, and the courage to admit when you're wrong." Meanwhile, outside, Josh's X post was spreading even faster. "Karoline Leavitt just knocked out our math class. Leavitt, math genius." Attached was a short clip of Leavitt at the board, effortlessly, solving a problem while chatting with students. The comments kept rolling in. "She's amazing. Dr. Williams is actually cool for owning up. I want to study math now." On YouTube, the reporters uploaded their full video titled, "Press Secretary vs. Professor, Shocking Outcome." Within hours, views skyrocketed. "Leavitt is a genius. She makes me want to go back to school." This session hadn't just impacted a classroom. It was now reaching thousands, maybe even millions, through screens worldwide. Dr. Williams turned off the classroom lights, briefcase in hand, and stepped into the hallway. Through the windows, he saw students still gathered outside talking about Leavitt. "She made me believe I can be better." The professor's not bad either, for admitting that in front of everyone. A warmth spread inside him. He wasn't the center of attention anymore, and for the first time in years, he was okay with that. Leavitt had taught him a lesson bigger than math, about humility, about learning from others, no matter who they were. He exhaled, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Thank you, Leavitt," he whispered. Then he walked off, his figure fading into the evening light. On social media, Leavitt Math Genius trended across X. The YouTube video hit tens of thousands of views in its first hour. At St. Ansel University, students shared the story with friends. Some, inspired by what they had seen, signed up for advanced math classes that night. One of them was the bespectacled girl who had asked Leavitt about her potential. Sitting in her dorm, she opened her math book and smiled. "I'll try," she whispered. Just like she said, Leavitt's impact wasn't just about one class, it was a spark, igniting belief, curiosity, and passion in everyone who had witnessed it. Dr. Williams arrived home late that evening. Sitting at his desk, he opened his laptop and stared at the blank email screen for a moment. Then he started typing. "Thank you for today. You changed me, and the class." He hit send, then leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He knew he would never forget this day, the day he had set out to humiliate someone, only to be redeemed by her instead. Somewhere out there, unaware of the email, Karoline Leavitt had left an indelible mark, not just as a math genius, but as a reminder that true intelligence isn't about status or reputation. It's about passion, about openness, and most importantly, about the willingness to learn.